What does it mean to you to apply a name to something, to give something a name? Is there something special about the act of doing that, something that we may not realize? And what does the Bible say about this? It actually does speak about this topic in this episode of Bible Scribe. I am Bible Scribe, and I am dedicated to bringing you simple and honest study of the Bible. I have studied a large body of works from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the early Christian writings. I am a technology professional, and I bring an analytical approach to the studies that we will do together. If you have been discouraged by the many voices telling you what the Bible says, stay tuned, because we will break through the noise and get to a plain understanding of the things of God, based on the Scriptures. Thank you for joining me in growing closer to Him. Let's get started. So, what is the significance of labeling something? What's in a name? Have you ever wondered about the significance of your name? Like, who named you? And why did they name you what they did? And then, why would a person change their name? All these questions have meaning in this discussion about naming or labeling things. It is interesting to me that there are so many names for some things. Like, for instance, right here. Are these glasses, or are they shades? Or is it sunglasses, eyewear, optics, spectacles? Each name for these forces you to understand them in a slightly different way, to ascribe a different meaning to them, different characteristics, a different perspective of thought about that object, right? For instance, in the scientific world, there are scientific names for animals. For biological organisms, they all have a Latin name and an English name, and sometimes multiple names. Some more specific, some less specific. So, for instance, dogs, they also have the name Canis. And every language on earth has its own name for this animal. And some of these names actually change meaning based on the culture of the language of the name that's given to that animal in that culture. But the Latin Canis, in our understanding of the scientific name that's been given to dogs, Canis is a reference in Latin to the sharp, pointy canine teeth of the animal. So it describes a property of the animal we know as dog. And in science, it's always the person that discovers the animal or thing that gets to name it, right? Some animals and species are even actually named after the person who discovered them. So just recognize now that the names of things are usually given by the discoverer or the person who just decides to name the thing, all right? So why are things given a name or a label? So in the case of the dog, the Canis, it is to describe a property. That name describes a property of the dog, the sharp teeth. And often this is the case, but let's think a little deeper about naming and what that means, or the effect that has, not only on the named item, but on the people who hear that name. So I wanted to do a little exercise. There is a story I kind of want to tell you. And this is a story of a monster, okay? So indulge with me in this thought game, okay? So if there's two people in the wilderness and they happen upon this brand new creature, this animal, like the one in front of you perhaps, let's say it's an unrecognizable creature. They don't know, never seen anything like it. It looks like nothing these two people have ever seen before. So they might call this a monster, but let's think about this, okay? let's say this creature attacks the people, and the power of the creature is such that it's a match for the people. It's a struggle. And in this struggle to defeat this creature or get away from it, they have to make a strategic plan to do so. So imagine that they run from this creature and hide behind a rock, and for a moment they are planning an attack. And let's say one of those individuals names the monster and calls it, say, the Ranthor monster. So Ranthor is the name of this monster, according to one of those people. So in describing a plan of attack against the Ranthor, this person that's named the animal and the creature has a distinct advantage because he has called it a name, has given it a name. And what is that advantage? Well, they can easily now refer to the creature and be specific about what creature they mean. It's not just the monster or the thing that looks like a bear or any other kind of description. It's now a named creature. They can communicate this creature easily to other people. They can attribute properties now to this creature whom they have named that are then associated with it, and when the name is used, those properties are brought to mind. So by naming the creature, associating properties to it, they now have created an idea that when they speak this name, it comes into the mind, the idea of the creature, its properties, its attributes. And so, when people will hear this name, they will know what is being spoken of specifically. And as long as the creature now has this name, his personality, characteristics, and attributes will hold with that name and go with it, and can easily be communicated to others. So let's say in our story that these two individuals, they're hiding behind the rock. They make a plan after they've named this creature and say, we're going to have to attack the Ranthor monster this way and do this to Ranthor and do that to Ranthor. And they get away. They distract him and they get away. And they go back to the town, okay? And let's say they're walking through the town, but their goal is now to tell other people about this monster. So when they get to their hometown, they are trying to relate the story of what happened to other people. And the one who had named this animal refers to it as the Ranthor. The other one goes around telling people that some monster was out there. But this other one goes around saying it's the Ranthor. It's Ranthor. And he attributes then, he tells the story and attributes attributes to that, and the name catches on. And people associate the name with those characteristics and with that specific creature who's being described. Without that name, the other guy goes off and says it's a monster, it's hideous, it's a beast. And then nobody has a thought, an idea around which to capture the properties of what he's talking about. It's harder for them to understand. It's harder for them to think of and relate because there's no name. But the one does call it the Ranthor and goes and tells all the people about the Ranthor. And do you think that the people that heard these stories would be more likely to repeat the story as these two guys saw this monster in the woods, or these two guys saw this monster called the Ranthor? Which is more memorable? Which are people going to then repeat? And how are they going to tell that story? They will tell it by the name of the monster. And that story with the name, it gives it more weight. It's memorable. And it's likely that that telling of the story will live much longer in the minds of the hearers than a story about an ambiguous monster around which they cannot attribute the properties of that monster. They have no name on which to join the properties of the monster. So the story then dies in obscurity. Now think about the power given to that narrative of the guy who simply used the name of the creature to tell the story. The power of it, the repeatability of it. Not only this, but the one that named the creature will be also seen by others as the expert on the creature. The one who doesn't use the name and says, oh, it's a monster, it's a beast. The one who says it's the Ranthor monster and it has these attributes, he will be seen as the expert. The other will be seen as, well, he's just talking about it. He doesn't know much. Do you kind of understand how it's starting to make sense, that that's how it would be? If you can envision that in your head, think about that. You see that the naming of the creature brings weight. It brings power to the narrative of that monster and the description of that monster. So how does this play out in the real world? How does this play out in the real world for us? Let me get this up for you. In the field of psychiatry, there are many diagnoses for the conditions that many people have. These are considered to be psychological conditions. They're looked at in the field of psychology almost like a disease, as it would be called in the medical field. But how did this come about? Most psychological conditions used to be, in the ancient past, they would be attributed to demonic activity. People with minds that didn't work like everyone else's, or crazy people, or mad, they would send them to be exiled because they said they had demons. Oftentimes. And of course, they were much more rare. These conditions were much more rare before pharmaceuticals of all sorts in our modern age were prescribed by modern pharmacology to the people that have these conditions. And that's really a rabbit trail I don't want to go into as far as the financial monetary cycle of pharmaceuticals, but think about that. The labeling of these conditions like schizophrenia, bipolarism, anxiety disorder, ADD, ADHD. And what goes along with each of these disorders? A long list of high-priced pharmaceutical drugs that can help you, quote, help you overcome these disorders, with a long list of side effects. and recognize they don't cure you either. And do you know, there's these conditions and these, quote, remedies and drugs for these conditions of psychological conditions, depression, anxiety, all these things. And do you know that what the way is that they diagnose these conditions? Now, in the medical community, the diagnosis of a disease is by a, quote, scientific test, right? They'll take your blood, they'll put it through a chemistry type test to analyze the components, break it down and see what's in it, and decide whether or not that is a marker for the disease that you are testing for. However, in psychology and psychiatry, it is simply the word of a certified professional that gives you a diagnosis. And these certified professionals are trained by a certified group or association of professionals. And they have a certified agenda in what they teach and how they teach these diagnoses. I have seen testimonies from a few different psychologists and psychiatrists that say that the diagnoses given in psychology and psychiatry are simply at the whim of the psychologist, that they are not true medical or scientific diagnoses. So do you see in that the power of simply naming a disorder, naming it, labeling it? If I can label your child ADHD, then what power does that give me as a psychiatrist or a psychologist? As a psychiatrist, I can then prescribe medications based on my own diagnosis. And in fact, I can possibly, for some of those medications, get a kickback from the pharmaceutical companies for doing so. But just to show you that the naming of those diagnoses, of those conditions, before anyone used the term ADHD, it wasn't a diagnosis. It wasn't a condition that was seen as something to be treated. But by making it and renaming it ADHD, whereas before it might have just been called hyperactivity, This child has extra energy. Now, if we name it, we can treat it with a diagnosis, a self-fulfilling diagnosis of pharmaceutical drugs. Do you see the power of what happened with giving it the label? It allows them a measure of control. So that's in the field of psychology and psychiatry. What about this field? What about demonology? Now, there's a lot in this field that can be said, but just know that in demonology, especially in the practices of exorcism, that a demon's name must be called before you can exert authority over that demon in doing an exorcism or any other rite like that involves demons. And it's just interesting. I have read many of these, but I had an interest at one time. I read a bunch of magic grimoires, which are instruction books mostly from the Middle Ages about how to deal with demons. And in some cases, how to summon them or bind them. And it's just interesting that almost all of them start with the naming of the demon that you are to act on. In the Sword of Moses, it says, I conjure you, Asliel. I conjure you, Erel. Tenael, I call you. Tephael, I call you. And the most glorious of these, Yophiel Mitron, I call you, the glory from above. All right? It's always about the names. The naming of the demon gives the power. In the 6th book of Moses, it says, I, a servant of God, desire, call upon you, and conjure thee through water, fire, air, earth, everything that lives and moves therein, by the holy names of God, that you yield obeisance to me. And the name of that demon is given there. I can't pronounce it. It says, I call upon the Och, is what it looks like. In the Testament of Solomon, another magic grimoire says, this is actually an ancient writing. It's a story of the involvement of Solomon, King Solomon, with demons. He says, I, Solomon, having heard the name of the archangel, prayed and glorified God, the Lord of heaven and earth, and I sealed the demon and set him to work at stone cutting so that he might cut stones in the temple. So he said, after hearing the name of the archangel, that he sealed the demon and set him to work at stone cutting. The name was required before he could exert the authority over that being. So this idea of the naming or the labeling of a thing, giving you power over that thing, is not far-fetched. And we're going to go into the scriptures where it talks about this very thing, actually, in just a little bit. I also found on a Catholic website, the name of the website is Aletheia, but in an interview with an exorcist from Switzerland, a very high-ranking exorcist in the Catholic Church in Switzerland, it asks, why do you ask for the demon's name? And he says, his answer, this is from a very experienced exorcist in the Catholic Church, the ritual requires it for a specific purpose. Naming something or knowing its name means having power over that thing. At the instant that the demon reveals his name, it shows it has been weakened. If he does not say it, then he is still strong. And so just realize that all invocations, bindings, and casting out of demons always begins with the name of the demon, calling the name of the demon to exert authority over it. If you don't name it, then that authority isn't recognized. It's just very interesting in this discussion of naming and labeling things and what effect does that have. And apparently in the realm of demonology, it has quite an effect. Now, what about this topic, sexuality? In our culture, this is very skewed right now, but this idea of labeling or naming things comes into play. So the Bible, and I was just reading through this the other day in the book of, I believe it was Leviticus. The Bible says that it's wrong for a man to lie with another man as if it was a woman, meaning homosexual sexual relations are wrong. This is in the law in the Old Testament, in Leviticus. But the progressive narrative of our day uses many different labels to drive understanding in this area, doesn't it? So for instance, these are some of the labels. I'm not going to speak all these because there's censors out there, but you can see them for yourself. And doesn't each of these labels come with an agenda behind it? Pushing of a narrative. Do you remember the day and age when we didn't have these labels? A lot of these labels and the ones that go along with all these, they didn't exist. And why did they create these labels? Do you realize that once the media labeled these things this way and started pushing the idea of these labels, these names for these things over and over again in the news media and on your local news all day, every day, that from that point on, we as Christians had a huge war on our hands to fight these things, to fight these ideas. But until they named these things and tried to use that as a control mechanism, we didn't have that kind of fight. It wasn't as much of a battle. But now it's a battle. It's war for Christians. Do you see the power that these labels gave to the people that made these labels? To push and move our understanding in a certain direction. And not just Christians, obviously that was for everyone. To move society's understanding of a certain thing in a certain way, so that they, after labeling, could then exert control. It's a cyclical kind of thing. You come in the front door with the label, and you come in the back door with the power and the control. The labels have given these people power to wage war against truth and against God's design for men and women. That's just a fact. And now you know why they've created and perpetrated these labels. It's to drive your thinking, to drive it, to move it in a certain direction. So what does the Bible say about this stuff? What does the Bible say? It's funny to me that the Bible actually does tell us all about this power, the power of names and labels. And where do we get that? It's from Genesis. Chapter 2, verse 19 and 20. Out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field, every fowl of the air, and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living thing, that was the name thereof. And Adam gave names to all the cattle, to the fowl of the air, every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found an helpmeet for him. So in these verses we see that God gave Adam and allowed him the task of naming the creatures, all the created things, of giving them all names. And so you have to wonder, wow, that's interesting. Why did God give him that? You know, when we first read these stories, we sometimes don't think. We're just like, he named all the animals. Okay, yay. Well, why is that significant, though? You know, there's a lot of things Adam probably was doing in the Garden of Eden. Why is it significant that God tells us he named them? Well, it's because Adam and man in general was created to rule the earth and all that was in it. And many ancient texts, not just the Bible, say this. And that this naming, just as we've established with other things, that it's a way of exerting authority over a thing. And because Adam had the authority given to him by God over all of creation, and again, there's many texts that say this, given him the authority over all creation, that was his job to name the things and exert that authority, his rulership, his stewardship of those things. Genesis chapter 1, if we go back just a little bit, talks a little bit about this as well. God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them, men, have dominion over the fish of the sea, and the fowl of the air, and the cattle, and the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth, subdue it, rule over, dominion, and subdue it. and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, every living thing that moves on the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every herb-bearing seed, all the plants which is on the face of the earth, every tree in which is the fruit of a yielding seed, and to you it shall be for meat, for food. And every beast of the earth, and fowl of the air, and thing that creepeth on the earth, wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for meat, and it was so. So all these things God names, he gave to Adam in rulership. That's what dominion is. He was told to multiply, fill the earth, subdue the earth, rule over it. And that doesn't mean destroy the earth, but that means steward the earth. You're the ruler of this, Adam. That's what in other texts it's very clearly said that that's what God made man for, to be the ruler over creation. And so it's very interesting that he just says this in the Bible and gives us this information that this is a powerful thing, to have the authority to name things. So in giving Adam the task of naming the animals, he was telling Adam, exert your authority over them, the authority I give you. And why do you think Satan was jealous of Adam? Well, it's because of this. Because Adam did have a reign, a kingdom, and Satan was jealous of Adam, and he didn't think he should serve Adam because Satan said, I am beautiful and I was created first. And I don't care about that authority you're giving him, that rulership. I won't bow down to man and serve. And so that is the story of how Satan began his fall. But that is just more evidence that God gave man that authority, and that this naming has power. The naming of things has power and a measure of control with it. So the power of labels, naming something, as we've seen here, naming something is power. Naming something is control. What happens when the news or the media names something, and then every time that topic is discussed, they drive that name home for those things that they've named, and they use those names instead of the previous names those things had. They make up new names for things. Why do you think that is? So they can control that narrative. They can control the way you understand those things. A new name means a new way of understanding something. So if they want to control the narrative on a certain thing, they rename it. They give it a new name. They reformulate your ideas on that thing. And then they can attribute, just as we saw in the story of the monster, they can attribute characteristics to that name. They've got a new name for something and they attribute new characteristics to it. So they shift your understanding in the direction they want. So here's some things that you could think about. This is one that first came to mind. And this new name came about 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. A polar vortex. Do you remember in the news when the weather we had a big storm or something one year, or it was really cold one winter, and they said it's a polar vortex. We had never heard that term before in the news, ever. But this year was a polar vortex. Why do you think they used that name? Why do you think they used the name climate change or climate denier? What do those names mean to you? And why were they created? How have they shifted your understanding of those topics? What about transsexual or transphobic? Those are new terms as of the past few years. How have they shifted your understanding? What have they named that prior to that you would not have used that term for them? And how has that shifted your understanding? If you label it, you can create it, even if it doesn't exist sometimes. What about feminism? I hope you do know that word was created and named by a family of people called the Rockefellers, if you didn't know that. And why did they create the word feminism? Because they wanted to start a social movement so that they could get women in the workforce and get women to vote so they could push politicians based on the manipulation of women. What about, here's one that's really pertinent right now, anti-vaxxers. What does that mean to you? Why would they have created that label when it actually applies to very few people? What about racist? How has that term been used to label people? What about white supremacist? Is that an accurate description of people, or is that just a term that's been made to force your understanding of certain groups of people? What about Islamic extremist? How does that label shift your understanding? Before we used the term Islamic extremist, we only had the term Muslim. And using the term Islamic extremist separated our understanding of what a Muslim and his faith based on the writings of the Quran, it separated from that violent extremist Muslims. Even though it's highly likely they are acting on the same tenets of the same book as the nonviolent. Isn't it? So by making the term Islamic extremist, we've created a new class of people that we can blame for those beliefs that lead to violence. What about, and this is where rubber meets the road for Christians, what about dispensationalist, futurist, preterist? These are terms that force understanding. When you have one applied to you, meaning comes with those terms that may not actually apply to you. But those terms are used to put people in categories, right? Maybe not in such a maniacal or twisted way as some of these other terms, but just recognize the power of the labeling, the power of those labels, and what can happen when you fall under a label, or when you label something, or when someone else labels something. It's to drive authority and control, generally speaking. So the next time that you hear a new label in the news, a new term used for something that you haven't heard before, that's different, think about why that label, that name, was made for that thing, and what power it gives to those who made it and those who propagate that term. Why are they doing that? This idea, this way of thinking about this will help you understand the levers of control that people are trying to pull on you. The power of these labels. As Christians, we need to be able to recognize when the enemy uses this scheme against us, okay? In an effort to control the narrative and meaning, and in any situation, force people to believe a certain way about certain things. We must know and recognize that there is a war being waged on us as human beings by Satan and those who follow Satan. And if we do not recognize it, that we are being warred against, we will be consumed by it. There is no other alternative. If you acquiesce to their terms, to their names, to their labels, you will succumb to the meaning behind those terms. So be on guard, Christian. And God bless.